Chapter 1. Dr. Crippen. Murderer, Dr. Holly Crippen met Cora Turner in New York in July 1892. He was 30 years old and was working in a hospital, and she was 19. Crippen had been married before, but his first wife had died. He immediately fell in love with Cora, and 6 months later they were married. At first, they continued to live in New York, and Crippen joined a company which sold medicines. This was Cora's idea. She wanted her husband to earn more money than the hospital was paying him. Cora wanted to be a singer, so her husband paid for her to have singing lessons. Her voice was not really good enough, and she wasn't very successful. Later, when the couple moved to London, she did begin to sing in theaters, although she was never famous. Crippen was not allowed to work as a doctor in England because he had trained in America, so he continued to work for the American Medicine Company and opened a London office for them. In 1905, the Crippens moved to a house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent. They were not happy together. Cora was a cruel, violent woman, and the couple were always arguing, often because Cora spent more money than they could afford. She also liked to be with other men. In 1907, Crippen fell in love with his secretary, Ethel Leneve. Ethel wanted him to leave his wife and marry her, but Crippen would not, or was afraid to, do this. Then, in December 1909, Cora discovered that her husband and Ethel Leneve were lovers. She warned Crippen that she would leave him and take most of his money with her. On January 31, 1910, two of Cora's theater friends, Paul and Clara Martinetti, came to dinner with the Crippens, and during the evening Cora and her husband argued violently. The Martinettis left early. The next week, Crippen told neighbors and friends that Cora had gone to America to look after someone who was sick. This came as a surprise. Cora had said nothing to them about a sick friend or about traveling to America. Then, some weeks later, Crippen sold several of Cora's rings and some of her other valuables, and in March, Ethel Leneve moved into 39 Hilldrop Crescent to live with Crippen. Later, when Crippen told the Martinettis and other friends of Cora's that she had become ill and had died in America, they could not believe it and suspected that he was lying. Finally, one of the friends went to the police with the story. Inspector Walter Dew of London Scotland Yard, England's most famous police station, visited Crippen soon after this and talked with the doctor and Ethel Leneve. Crippen spoke calmly and confidently about his wife, making no secret of the fact that Ethel Leneve had been his lover for several years. He also agreed that the story about his wife's death had been a lie. The truth was, he told the detective that Cora went to America to live with a lover, Bruce Miller, who had been one of her theater friends in England a few years before. Inspector Dew was not completely happy with this story, but neither was he able to prove that Crippen was lying. But Crippen was not as confident as he pretended to be. The visit from Inspector Dew had worried him, and after the detective left, he told Ethel Leneve that they must go away and make a new life for themselves in another country. They began by getting a boat to Holland, then went on to Brussels in Belgium, where they moved into a hotel for several days. When Inspector Dew visited Crippen's office on July 11th, he was surprised to find the place closed and Crippen gone. Immediately, he gave orders to search the house at Hilldrop Crescent, and it did not take his men long to find what remained of a woman's body under the house. She had been poisoned. On July 15th, Crippen read in a Belgian newspaper that part of a human body had been found under the house at 39 Hilldrop Crescent. He quickly got tickets to sail on a ship, the Montrose, which was going to Quebec in Canada. To make any discovery more difficult, Ethel Leneve dressed as a 16-year-old boy and pretended to be Crippen's son. They used the name Robinson. The ship sailed for Canada on July 20th, but the captain of the Montrose, Henry Kendall, had read about Dr. Crippen in the newspapers. He remembered photographs of Crippen and Ethel Leneve and began to suspect that Mr. John Robinson and his son were not what they seemed. Sometimes the two men held hands, he noticed, and Mr. Robinson seemed to have had a mustache until recently. The more the captain thought about it, the more sure he became that these were the two people the police were looking for. Kendall sent a radio message back to his company office in London. The information was passed to Inspector Dew, who left England on the Laurentic, a faster ship than the Montrose, which was also going to Quebec. The English newspapers quickly heard what was happening, and for the next week, helped by information coming from Captain Kendall on the Montrose, began to report the chase across the sea for their readers. It made exciting reading. Dr. Crippen and his lover knew nothing about any of this, of course, and were quietly confident that nobody had recognized them. So it was an unhappy surprise for them when they discovered Inspector Dew waiting for them in Quebec. Together with a Canadian policeman, Dew boarded the Montrose and arrested Crippen and Ethel Leneve. They were the first criminals ever to be caught through using a radio message. Dew returned to London with them. They arrived on August 28th. Dr. Crippen's trial, which began on October 18th, took just 3 days. The jury first heard how he had poisoned his wife with hyoscine, then cut up her body and buried it under his house. No one was surprised when they found him guilty of murder. Ethel Leneve was tried as an accessory, someone involved in the crime although not there when it happened, but she was found not guilty. Dr. Holly Harvey Crippen was hanged on the morning of Wednesday, November 23, 1910, in Pentonville Prison. Hanging was the normal punishment for murderers in England at that time. Ethel Leneve went to live in America, but later came back to England using a different name. Later, she married and had children. She died in 1967. Chapter 2. The Mona Lisa Robbery. At 7 o'clock on the morning of Monday, August 21st, 1911, 3 cleaners in the Louvre Museum in Paris were walking through one of the rooms, the Salon Carré. The 3 men stopped to look at one of the world's most famous paintings, the Mona Lisa. "This is the most valuable picture in the world," said one of the men. "They say it's worth 1.5 million francs. After staring at the famous smile for a moment or two, the 3 men then walked on to the Grand Gallery, which was the next room, to continue with some repair work. It was 8:35 a.m. before they passed through the Salon Carré again, and one of the men noticed that the Mona Lisa had now gone. "They've taken it away," he laughed. "They're afraid we'll steal it." The other men laughed with him and went back to their work. It was not unusual for someone to move a painting in the gallery. They were often taken away to be photographed, and then put back later, so the 3 cleaners did not think any more about it. At 7:20 the next morning, Poupardin, one of the Louvre guards, passed through the Salon Carré and noticed that the Mona Lisa was not in its place. He too thought someone had taken it away to be photographed. At 9 a.m., a man called Louis Barou arrived at the museum. He was a painter and was painting a picture of the Salon Carré. "Where is the Mona Lisa?" he asked Poupardin. "It's being photographed," replied the guard. Beroud was annoyed. He wanted to continue his work, but he decided to wait for the return of the famous painting. He waited all morning. "What are they doing with it?" he asked himself. Then early that afternoon, he told Poupardin to go and ask the photographer to send back the painting. "I don't have much more time," he said. Poupardin went away and came back quickly. "The picture isn't there," he said excitedly. "They don't know anything about it." And he hurried away to find his boss, Georges Benedit. At 3 p.m. that afternoon, people were asked to leave the Louvre. "The museum is closing," they were told, but were not given any explanation. It was not until they read the newspapers the next day that most of them discovered the reason. Someone had stolen the Mona Lisa. The museum was closed for a week. Police believed that the famous painting might still be hidden somewhere inside, and they began to search. Everyone working at the museum had their fingerprints taken. Then the police found the empty frame from the Mona Lisa on some back stairs. Slowly, they began to put together their own picture of what had happened. The thief came to the museum on Sunday, August 20th, and hid in the building after the galleries closed. At 7:30 a.m. the next morning, he took the Mona Lisa, then went into another room and down the stairs where the police later found the frame. He stopped to take the painting out of the frame, then went on to a door which led into a courtyard. The door was locked, so he had to take off the doorknob and break it open. He had only managed to take off the doorknob when he heard a noise. So he pushed the doorknob into his pocket and sat on the stairs. A man working for the museum walked by. He said later that he thought the man on the stairs was one of the museum cleaners, and he unlocked and opened the door for him. The thief went out into the courtyard, walked across it, and opened an unlocked door that led into the street. He ran off towards the Pont du Carrousel, throwing the doorknob away as he ran. The police found it later. When the Louvre opened again, crowds hurried to look at the empty place on the wall of the Salon Carré. They could not believe their eyes. The Mona Lisa really had been stolen. Police questioned hundreds of people, searched hundreds of houses, flats, and rooms, took fingerprints, and talked to other criminals. They also found a thumbprint on the glass in the empty picture frame. But they did not find the Mona Lisa, and as time went on, the people of France began to believe that they would never again see the famous picture they loved so much. Then, one morning in November in 1913, Alfredo Geri, a man who bought and sold paintings, opened a letter in his office in Florence in Italy. The letter was from Paris, from someone who signed his name as Leonard. The writer said that he was an Italian living in Paris. He said that he had stolen the Mona Lisa and wanted to return it to Italy, where it belonged, and where it had been before it was stolen, during the war with France in the 19th century. At first, Geri thought the letter was probably from a madman, but to be sure, he showed it to his friend Giovanni Poggi at the Uffizi Gallery in Florence. They decided to write to Leonard and ask him to bring the painting to Milan. On Wednesday, December 10th, a thin young man with a small dark mustache arrived at Geri's office. He told Geri that the Mona Lisa was in his hotel room and that he wanted 500,000 lire, $100,000 for the picture. Next day, Geri and Poggi went to the young man's room in the Hotel Tripoli Italia, and there was the famous painting. Poggi asked if he could take it to the Uffizi Gallery and look at it together with photographs of the real Mona Lisa. The young man agreed. and the three of them went to the gallery. Later, the young man went back to his hotel and was arrested by Italian detectives. The young thief's real name was Vincenzo Perugia, and he was a house painter. He was actually one of the many people questioned by the French police not long after the painting was stolen, because he had once been employed by the museum. They had searched his room at the time, but had found nothing. Was someone hiding the painting for him? Perugia had been in trouble with the law before, for a robbery, but his fingerprints, kept by the police, only showed his right thumb, and the thumbprint from the glass in the empty frame had been a print of the left thumb. Now the police searched his Paris rooms once more, and this time they found a 1910 diary with a list of the names of people who bought and sold paintings in America, Germany, and Italy. They also questioned two other Italian house painters. They suspected them of hiding the picture at the time Perugia's rooms were first searched. Finally, they had to let them go. The trial of Vincenzo Perugia began on June 4, 1914, in Florence. When questioned, this is what he told the judge. I entered the Louvre about 7 o'clock in the morning. Without being seen, I was able to get into the Salon Carré. I took the Mona Lisa, took it out of its frame, then left. How did you leave? Asked the judge. The same way I came in, answered Perugia. He was sent to prison for 1 year and 15 days, but this was later shortened to 7 months. Some people believe that Perugia was working with other criminals, one of whom was a painter, and that they offered the missing Mona Lisa to rich Americans who collected paintings. Each of the American collectors bought their Mona Lisa secretly, not realizing that it was forged by one of the criminals and that other forgeries were being sold too. Could it be true? We may never know. Chapter 3. The Lindbergh Kidnapping. It was evening on Tuesday, March 1st, 1932. Charles and Anne Lindbergh finished dinner at their large country house near the village of Hopewell in New Jersey, USA, and Charles Lindbergh went to work in his library. Soon after 9 p.m., he heard a noise like something breaking. But it was a stormy night, and he thought it was probably thunder. His wife heard nothing. Upstairs, their son, Charles Jr., often called Little It, was asleep in his bed. Just after 10 p.m., Betty Gow, the child's nurse, went to check that Charles Jr. was all right. She found the little bed empty and the child missing. Quickly, she went to find Mrs. Lindbergh, but the boy was with neither his mother nor his father. In the child's bedroom, the window was open, and there was rainwater and dirt on the floor. There was also an envelope. Lindbergh called the police, and they hurried to the house. Detectives quickly found a rough wooden ladder about 25 meters from the window of the child's bedroom, and 2 footprints in the garden. The top step of the ladder was broken, and Charles Lindbergh remembered the noise he had heard earlier. A detective checked the envelope for fingerprints but found none. He opened it. Inside was a note in poor English. Dear Sir, have $50,000 ready, $25,000 in $20 bills, $15,000 in $10 bills, and $10,000 in $5 bills. After 4 days we will inform you are to deliver the money. We warn you for making anything public or for notify the police. The child is in good care. At the bottom of the letter were 2 open blue circles and a filled blue circle where they touched. The Lindberghs were very rich and famous people. Charles Lindbergh was the first man to fly a plane alone across the Atlantic, from New York to Paris in 33.5 hours. In 1927. And Anne Lindbergh was the daughter of Dwight Morrow, one of the richest bankers in the East. And now their son had been kidnapped. Soon all America heard the news on the radio, or read it in their newspapers the next morning. President Hoover promised to do everything he could to see that the kidnappers were caught. Al Capone, the famous American criminal, who was in prison at that time, offered to help find the child through his friends and contacts in the criminal world. For this, he wanted his freedom. The U.S. government refused his offer. Usually, the Lindberghs only went to their Hopewell home at weekends. Normally, they spent the rest of the week with Anne Lindbergh's family in Englewood, which was nearer to New York. But Charles Jr. had caught a cold, and Mrs. Lindbergh wanted him to stay at Hopewell until he was better. So how did the kidnappers know that the Lindberghs were there that Tuesday evening? It was one of the first questions detectives asked. People working for the Lindberghs were immediately suspected of having a part in the kidnapping. The child's nurse, Betty Gow, was questioned carefully, but the police finally let her go. Another woman working at the Lindbergh house, 28-year-old Violet Sharp, first told the police that she was at the cinema on the night of the kidnapping. Later, she changed her story and said that she had been with a man. In May, she changed her story again. On June 10th, when she heard that the police wanted to question her once more, she killed herself. Lindbergh told the newspapers that he would not try to injure the kidnappers if they returned the boy safely when they got the money. He then hired 2 criminals to try and contact the kidnappers. But before Lindbergh's helpers could do anything, the kidnappers made contact with Dr. John Francis Condon, a 72-year-old teacher who sometimes wrote for the New York paper, Bronx Home News. He was told to take Lindbergh's money to the Woodlawn Cemetery in the Bronx. A meeting time was arranged over the telephone, and Condon went to the cemetery. He saw an Italian-looking man walk by with something across half his face, and guessed that the man was checking to see if there were any police or detectives around. Then Condon saw a second man standing in the shadows, his hat pulled down over his face and something covering his mouth. When the second man spoke, Condon recognized the voice. It was the man who had spoken to him on the telephone. He was about 35 years old and had brown hair. He said his name was John and that there were 6 people in the gang, 2 of them women. He told Condon that the child was well, but then asked, "Would I burn if the baby is dead? Would I burn if I did not kill it?" By would I burn, he meant would he die in the electric chair, the punishment used in America at that time for kidnappers and murderers. Condon saw the danger at once. If the police caught a kidnapper, he would die, whether the kidnapped child lived or not. So if a kidnapper thought he was going to be caught, he would kill the child. Condon and the man made more arrangements to contact each other. Then Cemetery John, as he became known, disappeared into the night. Several more messages were passed between the 2 men, and then Condon received a package in the post. Inside were Charles Lindbergh Jr.'s sleeping suit and a note making arrangements for the money to be handed to the kidnappers. At 7:45 p.m. on Saturday, April 2nd, 1932, Condon and Lindbergh went to Raymond's Cemetery in the Bronx. Lindbergh waited in the car while Condon went into the cemetery. They both heard a voice shout, "Hey, Doc!" Soon after, the man calling himself John appeared, with his hat pulled down over his face. "I have $50,000, said Condon. The man gave him a note. It said that the boy was on a boat called Nellie, near the Elizabeth Islands, off the coast of Massachusetts. Lindbergh searched for several days, but he never found the boat. Then, on May 12th, two lorry drivers found the body of Charles Lindbergh Jr. in some woods about 7 kilometers from the Lindbergh's Hopwell house. He had died only a few hours after the kidnapping on March 1st. The police knew the numbers on the dollar bills which Condon gave to the kidnappers, and they began to watch for them. But it was September 16th, 1934, before detectives caught a 34-year-old German, Bruno Richard Hauptmann, when he paid for petrol with a $10 bill, one of the cemetery John bills. When Hauptmann was arrested, police found another of the bills in his pocket, and at his home they discovered another $13,760 of Lindbergh's money. They also learned that Hauptmann was a carpenter, whose job it was to make things from wood, like ladders. Hauptmann said that the money belonged to a business friend, Isidor Fisch, who had gone back to Germany and died there in March 1934. Hauptmann said Fisch had left the money behind when he went to Germany, and because Fisch had owed Hauptmann about $7,500, Hauptmann had taken it. "I had no part in the kidnapping," Hauptmann told detectives, "and I did not write the notes to Lindbergh." But the police refused to believe him, and they said that the writing on the notes was the same as Hauptmann's. At the trial in January 1935, Charles Lindbergh said that he recognized Hauptmann's voice. He also changed his story. He now said that Cemetery John had called "Hey, Doctor," and not "Hey, Doc," and that he had spoken with a foreign accent. Dr. Condon, who was at first not sure that Hauptmann was a Cemetery John when questioned by the police, said at the trial that he was now sure that the German was the man to whom he had spoken in the cemetery. The jury believed both men. Hauptmann said that he had been working in New York at the time of the kidnapping. His wife and employer both agreed with this, although his employer would not speak at the trial, but the papers to prove it could not be found. The jury finally decided that Bruno Hauptmann was guilty of kidnapping and murder, and he died in the electric chair at Trenton State Prison, New Jersey, on April 3, 1936. But questions are still asked about the trial. Was the writing on the kidnap notes really Bruno Hauptmann's? How did Hauptmann know that Charles Lindbergh and his family were at the house near Hopwell on that stormy night in March 1932? He told the police that he had never been to the village of Hopwell and that he did not know it. We shall probably never know the whole truth.